US and India are holding crucial trade negotiations this week with Assistant USTR Brendan Lynch in New Delhi for talks on the bilateral trade agreement. The visit comes just days ahead of the 2nd April deadline for reciprocal tariffs. According to news agency Reuters, India is open to cutting tariffs on 55% of US imports. The reports also say that reciprocal tariffs would hit 87% of India's total exports to the US, worth $66 billion. In a reply to Parliament, the Ministry of Commerce has said that US reciprocal tariffs are yet to come into effect. The government said that India continues to engage with the US to achieve a mutually beneficial and fair trade deal, and the focus is on increasing market access, reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers, and increasing supply chain integration. President Trump has further escalated trade tensions by saying that US would levy a 25% tariff on any nation that imports oil from Venezuela. Just for context, in 2024, India imported 22 million barrels of oil from Venezuela, making up 1.5% of India's total crude oil purchase. Joining us right now on the tariff threats to India is Anup Wadhawan, India's former Commerce Secretary. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. How do you see this Reuters report, which says India is open to cutting tariffs on 55% of US imports? We understand that in trade negotiations, several permutations and combinations are made. But what is your sense on the kind of concessions India can comfortably make?
I think this report, of course, it is partly conjectural, I suppose, but there must be some basis to it, I'm presuming. And, 55% of the tariff lines traded with the US is not overly ambitious, and I think we can easily do it. If you look at many of our FTAs with, far more formidable manufacturing nations, whether it is Japan, Korea, the ASEAN countries, we've done agreements with much higher ambition, with over 80% of all the tariff lines going to zero. So 55% of the traded lines with the US is not an unmanageable number. I'm sure we can manage that, subject to getting, our ambitions met by the US side. So I'm not overly alarmed by it. In fact, I think it should be quite comfortable. I think there's an element of conjecture in this. I don't know how true it is and how well validated this news is.
Right.
But taking it on face value, I think it's manageable.
Okay. Now, let me ask you about a Wall Street Journal report, sir. They said that the US is now going to act in a more targeted fashion against countries, or at least 15% of the countries with whom the US has the highest trade deficit. Now, India is number 11 on list. China, the trade deficit is the highest at $270 billion. India is around $45 billion. So India could be among the countries which would be hit the hardest. But frankly speaking, sir, if we don't act, or if we're not able to have some sort of a carve-out or deal by the 2nd of April, how bad can things be, even if those reciprocal tariffs against India come into effect?
Yeah, so certainly, you see, this is the same thing as the reciprocal tariffs. So basically, what the report is saying is that when dealing with the countries with which US has the highest trade deficit, there'll be a particular focus, and there'll be some element of, deliberateness, if I can use the word, in dealing with these countries. So it's simply the mechanism for applying the reciprocal duties which has been amplified. So I don't think this by itself, again, is very alarming. Ultimately, that principle of reciprocal duties, whichever way it'll ultimately be exactly interpreted and implemented, it relates to the same thing. So certainly, there'll be some impact on our exports, but I don't see a catastrophic impact. There's some estimates that, in our exports of around $80-odd billion, there might be an impact of, say $6-odd million, maybe something plus minus on that. So what happens with the tariff is that, depending on the attachment American customers have with those particular Indian goods that are exported, the tariff is shared between the buyer in America and the exporter from India. So to the extent American consumers are attached to that product, prices will go up with the tariff for the American consumer, and to some extent, the price received by the Indian exporter will come down. So the tariff is always shared between the consumer and the exporter, and that is what will happen. So from good to good, the situation will vary. And, partly the exporter will absorb the tariff, partly the buyer will pay a higher price. So there will not be a catastrophic impact that, some lines, the exports will stop completely. Profitability will come down. Some volumes might come down at the margin, but I don't see a catastrophic impact.
Right.
And
Mr. Wadhawan, Ajay Srivastav of GTRI, somebody who's also been a trade negotiator, he has mentioned on record that India should withstand the US pressure right now. We should not concede everything that the US is asking in terms of major concessions on India's subsidy policies, MSP policies, intellectual property rights in the pharma sector, access for companies like Starlink on very easy terms. Do you feel that the threat of reciprocal tariffs is something that India can deal with, and it's probably not worth giving all those concessions to US as it may be demanding?
No, I think that is perfectly correct. We should not unilaterally give any concessions at all. Everything should be negotiated as part of the BTA, bilateral trade agreement, which is going to be negotiated. So, but anything you give outside the agreement gets pocketed and swallowed and put aside. And then you start from that point in the negotiation. So certainly I agree with him fully. We should not make any concessions outside the agreement. It is not going to help us at all. The reciprocal duties will still kick in, and we have to deal with them separately. And, further in trade sort of parlance and trade practices, there are strict protocols which countries have always followed. In President Trump's first term, when he put those security-related duties on steel, aluminum, we immediately put our countervailing duties. So that if they put the reciprocal duties, we must take whatever action we need to take by way of countervailing those duties. And to the extent, we can convince the Americans that this reciprocal duty route is not in good faith, then we are going to discuss a bilateral trade agreement. Either you can have a trade war and implement reciprocal duties, and then India has no option but to respond to them, based on standard trade practices. Or otherwise, you can have a more congenial environment in which to negotiate the BTA. So both can't go together. I'm quite puzzled at the way, the US side is taking this forward. And I think we should, urge the Americans that have a good faith negotiation in a quick time frame where you can have a mutually beneficial outcome, for both sides.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Wadhawan, for joining us with your perspective on the ongoing trade negotiations and also the kind of pressure that is building up from the United States. On that note, we take a short break, but don't go anywhere. When we return, we're going to get you an exclusive interview with the co-chairman of global direct selling firm, which is into wellness, health and nutrition. That is Amway, and the co-chairman of Amway, Doug DeVos, will be joining us.